Welcome to the 2023 Vermont Organics Recycling Summit, organized by the Composting Association of Vermont in partnership with Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. I'm Natasha Duarte, Director of the Composting Association of Vermont. This year's summit is being held as a kickoff event for International Compost Awareness Week, which starts on May 7th. International Compost Awareness Week is the largest and most comprehensive education initiative of the compost industry. And the theme this year is for healthier soil, healthier food, compost. I'd like to start by thanking all of our fabulous sponsors who allow us to put on this week-long program free of charge to participants, which is really great for encouraging participation and access to these sessions. Those include Community Bank, Eco Products, Nature Cycle, Vegware, Vermont Natural Ag Products, Addison County Solid Waste Management District, AgriLab Technologies, the Vermont Produce Program from the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, RMI, and Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund. The session today is maximizing the value of compost, extracts, products, and more. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and invite Jen to share her screen while I introduce her. Jenn Terry is with Compost for Good. She's written and implemented millions of dollars in grants through NYSERDA for the ANCA Clean Energy Program over the past 10 years. She transitioned to community composting in 2020 and is currently supporting ANCA to incorporate Compost for Good into the organization. She's raised over $300,000 in funding for Compost for Good to provide technical assistance to business, schools, organizations, manufacturers, academics, residents, farmers, and others. She's been growing and selling vegetables for 30 years and is a certified compost operator. Additionally, she is a co-owner of a food scrap collection business and compost facility. She's on several advisory committees representing the needs of community composters in New York. So thank you so much. Take it away.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And as Natasha shared, I am fully aware that usually the folks in the room have as much, if not more, experience and knowledge than the presenters. So happy to hear if you have a correction or an addition or a question and elaboration, please feel free to weigh in. So Compost for Good, we're on the other side of the pond from assumingly you all, if you all are here from Vermont. We don't really have a home base, but we are centered in the Adirondacks of Northern New York in general, but we definitely have a pretty broad reach throughout New York State and definitely and beyond as community scale composting gains interest globally. It's pretty interesting. So we, Compost for Good, have a very broad range of levels of support that we provide. We try to be as responsive as we possibly can. So it's part of our MO to be out in the field, listening to folks, hearing what they need, and then trying to customize our approaches. And then we'll go out and find grants, customize our programming to help support them. So one example of that is that we currently are implementing a grant to focus just solely on farmers, which in my opinion is the best work that we do. So rewarding, but there is a tremendous demand for wood chips in the area. And there's a lot of wood chips here, but getting the wood chips from the place where they're chipped to the place where the compost operators are operating or the farmers are trying to compost their mortality, there's this big gap in the middle. So that's an example. We're trying to work on that. We also offer a lot of technical assistance in terms of strategies, composting strategies, grant writing assistance. So we pretty much run the gamut. So not with us today are my two colleagues, Katie and John. John is in Scotland, and Katie has an unwell baby at home. So it is the three of us that are Compost for Good. So today we're going to focus on this topic is something that John Culpepper, one of the three of us, is very passionate about and brings into our discussions on a regular basis. Is the concept of compost is something that pretty much anybody can do, but to compost in a certain capacity to make biologically complete compost, to use your composting process to its maximum ability, there's a bit more to that. So that's what we're going to talk about during this presentation. But before we get too far into it, and thanks to Natasha and Ellie for helping me work some of the logistics out with this video stuff. One of the things that is in our toolkit is that we are trying to really nourish this community scale composting culture that is, it to us, maybe it's just that we are just really emerging ourselves in it, and Vermont, I think, is ahead of us, but in Northern New York, this seems pretty recent, and it is a tidal wave of interest. It is so exciting. It's such an exciting time. So one of the things that we do is we just are trying to build that culture. So this is a video that we had made. It's pretty short, with a local videographer, to try and get people pretty pumped up about community scale composting.
This is community composting. And so is this. And this.
We compost for along reasons. We compost for a more stable and resilient environment, now and into the future. We compost for our future.
We compost for more healthy, sustainable food.
We compost for a more circular local economy.
We compost.
We
compost.
We compost for good.
We compost for good. Do you?
Yay! So that is that's our video. That's the first of a series of videos that we have coming down the pike. Each one, that's kind of the one that we start as an umbrella, and then each series from there will drill down on a certain aspect of community scale composting. And we have one targeting farmers. It's a little more technical that will be coming out shortly as well. So thanks for indulging us. We're pretty excited about that, the video. And if you saw, there's a fair amount of in-vessel drum composters portrayed in that, and I'll elaborate on that towards the end of the presentation. So some of this I chatted about, but in the picture off to the side are John, Katie, and myself. This is at North Country School Camp Treetops, which is where John Culpepper was the director of facilities, and kind of where this whole process started through their drum composter. We compost for good we often get the question of, like, are you a business? Are you a not-for-profit? We decided early on we did not want to try and go through the not-for-profit process ourselves. So we, in order to get funding, have affiliated ourselves with two powerhouse not-for-profits over here on this side of the lake. One is 80K Action, and the other is, as Natasha shared, the Adirondack North Country Association, or ANCA. So those are our two fiscal sponsors. Both have aspects that deal with farmers and food systems. And as I shared before, if you're interested in community scale composting, we will work with you. It's rapidly getting overwhelming for us, so we're definitely looking to expand our capacity. But we work with businesses, communities, farmers, pretty much you name it, lots of organizations. Different grants allow us to focus on different entities, though. And as I shared also in the beginning, what John tends to do, and he's supposed to be retired, that's why he's in Scotland, but he's really not retiring. We get a lot of interest from around the planet, and that's really inspiring to us. Norway, Scotland, Ireland, Nigeria, the list is Mexico, Belize. So we're all joking that at one point when we retire for real, we're going to go travel the world and set up community scale composting programs. So our vision is probably pretty much in line with a lot of the people in this call are in tune with, and that's that we believe in circular economy. We believe in the reimagining of waste as a resource. We do not allow anybody to say the word food waste. That is taboo. You cannot say that. So, but we also, we want to find ourselves squarely rooted in the community scale level of this work. So we aren't necessarily the ones that are going to come in and help you set up a massive facility. We feel like that's a great role for a consultant who will charge a fee, and that's kind of their business model, and that's fantastic. But we're not that level. We will have support for the backyard composters for sure, but that is also not our focus. So we're kind of in between those domains. and if you're kind of pulling out some of these keywords, this is our mission statement that took us like a week to come up with. But we also, it's one of the most important elements for us, back to that video, is peer-to-peer connections. We feel like that's as compelling as anything else, and really just helping, and we're not creating it, we're just part of this wave to help lend our support to this new culture of community scale composting. So again, we're gonna, in this presentation, we're gonna kind of take a little bit of a narrow focus on soil health and compost health. I will say that before meeting John Culpepper, I have been growing vegetables for a long time, and I'm like, oh, I'm a composter, I know what composting is. And since becoming in John's orbit, realize I know nothing. There's so much to learn, and any one aspect of compost that you even sort of peel back a couple of layers on, you really could be learning all of these things for the rest of your life. But one of the things that comes up over and over and over in this landscape, this current climate where we're struggling, we've got so many environmental challenges in front of us, and that so many of them can be addressed by really tapping into indigenous processes and indigenous knowledges. I will say that I was in a compost operator training, and an individual on the call pointed out that composting is fundamentally an indigenous practice, and I really appreciate that. And so there's a lot of terminology that we hear: organic, regenerative, permaculture, biological, but from our point of view, it all comes back to how does nature operate, and how can we support nature to operate at its optimal, how can we usher that whole process along. This is a lovely forest picture, and probably most of us in this presentation would look at this picture and probably all be on the same page, where we're not seeing trees, we're not seeing sunlight, we're not seeing this pretty moss carpet on the ground. We're probably all pretty much aware that there's a lot more going on in this picture than all of like the isolated reductionist parts of this picture. That there's what we see above soil, which we can't even begin to comprehend, how all of these trees are communicating with each other. There's sun coming in, they're making their own energy. Dear God, that's amazing. We can't do that. And that's what we see above it. And then what's going on below the soil line, though, because we don't see it, it tends to not get as much attention and as much support. So we're just now starting to really understand the layers of complexity of the networks that are happening underneath the soil line, communication networks, how plants talk to each other, how they interact with the microbial life that's down there. So again, if anybody on the call knows this, has information, has knowledge, has experience, I'd be happy to hear from you all, because it's an infinite level of knowledge. So what Compost for Good does, and this again under John Culpepper, that's him on the right in front of the microscope. That's me squinting, he's trying to teach me what he knows. So we bought a microscope with a grant a couple of years ago. The microscope connects to John's computer, so he can actually see the images on his computer screen. So he's not hunched over, looking through his little lenses and getting a crooked neck. He also can take videos off that screen, and it's pretty exciting. We did get another grant to purchase. We're going to be getting 2 more microscopes. One's going to be a little bit more sophisticated, where John can actually set up grids, and he can do some quantifications, which we'll talk about. But the other 2 microscopes we hope to distribute throughout the North Country, so that other farmers can have it in their toolkits of resources to help track their soil health and their compost health. So it's important to note that we use the word testing under the microscope, but this isn't necessarily testing. So most growers are familiar with the traditional testing process, which is incredibly important. So you, especially if you're making compost, a lot of compost operators ship your compost away, or maybe you have your own lab, and you can find out your nitrogen, your organic matter, your soluble salts, nutrient levels, water content, etc., which is all incredibly important information to have. But those are kind of the physical characteristics of their soil. And when we say soil/compost, there's a lot of composters that are going through the same exact process. So, and that's what I did as a compost operator, and got some great results back. And I was like, woo, high five, we're rocking it. And then John took some of our samples under a microscope, and it's like, okay, maybe there's some more work to do. So the microscope work, I I like the word analyze, because testing, we're not really testing for anything. We're just really trying to analyze what's going on the microbial level. And we'll talk about what should be happening in an optimal situation. So we at Compost for Good, currently our model for farm work is that they complete an intake form. We will go to the farms and do some soil sampling and some compost sampling if they're composting. And then from there, set up a implementation plan that will help them increase the amount of microbial health in their soils. And I will say at this point that even farmers that have been organic growing for decades, their soil health from a biological perspective is coming in pretty poor. So, and by poor, we'll explain what that means also in a few slides. So I'll maybe go through a couple more slides and then check in Natasha and see where we're at with questions or comments, or if anybody wants to weigh in. So as we saw that beautiful picture of the forest, when we look underground, there's more biomass underground than above ground. So we really should be paying close attention to all of that. And as I go down this journey, and I'm just starting the journey of soil health and microbial analyses, there is an incredibly complex relationship between all of the life that's in the soil and the plants that are occupying that soil. They talk, they communicate with each other, and they react to each other. And we're just beginning to understand the complexity. We'll never fully understand it, but we can certainly figure out how we can support this process. So we know some of these things, from high school. We know that there's a basic photosynthesis process. It's very energy intensive, and in some cases, up to 50% of the sugars produced by a plant will be pumped through the roots and into the soil. So this is where that communication starts to happen back and forth. So why would a plant do that? So if any of us pay attention, there's probiotics, get your probiotics, have probiotic yogurt, there's like probiotics in everything now. I feel like how is that probiotic in like gummy bear, but okay. So that's the human gut biome. So that same concept is going on in the soil health too as well. So that importance of diversity is really important and on a plant health level, just as important as it is to the human gut. So I will take a quick pause there, Natasha, and see if there's anyone that would like to chime in or ask questions.
No questions yet, but just a reminder, folks, if you want to put anything into the chat, you can do it at any time, and Jen will be checking in sort of periodically to encourage questions and discussion. So feel free to go ahead and put that in there.
Super, and you can cut me off too, Natasha, if something pressing or timely comes up. I don't mind being interrupted.
Great.
So here's some. John is a self-diagnosed autistic. He loves numbers. He loves to really geek out on these concepts of of numbers and like orders of magnitude are really is really interesting to him. So, but this is it's important again to understand what we're talking about in terms of volume and in terms of biomass. So 1 gram of soil is about 1 teaspoon. So that helps us kind of level set what a gram looks like. And 1 gram of soil contains about 10 to the 12th bacteria and miles of fungal hyphae. So that's a lot of zeros, basically is what it comes down to. A gram is a teaspoon. So and that's in a gram of soil. So if us as composters or as farmers consider from there how many teaspoons or grams of compost we are rolling through, there are a lot of microbes out there. So a lot of the way we talk about this work is that we are microbe farmers, that we set up the conditions to make the microbes happy and let them do their stuff. And from there, they kind of do their own thing. So another way of putting it is 1 trillion billion. And that's just in terms of numbers, but then there's also the concept of how many species of bacteria are embedded in these grams of soil or compost. And I'll point out too that what is really important is that as we go through this conversation, just like my gut biome is probably a little bit different than Natasha's, might be different than Ellie's, that the species that are in your soil could very well be very specific to your specific microbiome. So if you're going to be doing any sort of inoculation, or if you're thinking about encouraging your microbiology, it's something that you might want to try to develop in your own backyard, because there are reasons why your microbiota have adapted to your specific area, and you'd hate to input a bunch of inputs that then are selected out for whatever specific reason. That doesn't mean that's the only way to do it. It just means that that's an optimization. So again, anybody can compost anything. I have a really good friend. They have horses. They sell bags of chunky, wet, composted horse manure. I've used it before. It works beautifully. It's amazing. This conversation is to bring everything to a higher level. And it's also important to understand, outside of the compost domain, your backyard soil or your farm soil, like what's going on there. So the benefits of really focusing on this are that you can, if you are optimizing your soil's ability to cycle nutrients, and that's what this does. It optimizes the relationship between the plants and the availability of the nutrients. There's a fair amount of research that says that most nutrients are available in most soil. So it's not necessarily that your soil is depleted of nutrients. It's that your soil is depleted of the microbiome that will allow the plants and those nutrients to communicate with each other, so that the plants can make them, the terminology we hear and use a lot is readily available. So for farmers, the better your soil is, the fewer nutrients that you need to be adding, whatever format those nutrients might look. That the better your microbiology in your soil, the less money theoretically you're spending. There's a lot of evidence too that, and we'll talk about this, certain kinds of biomes favor microbiota favor certain stages of development. So weeds might, for example, favor a soil that's higher in bacterial content, and we'll explain that in a few minutes, what that looks like from a successional perspective. There's a lot of evidence too that soils enriched with compost or compost extracts have an increased water holding capacity. This has massive implications. I was just in a soil water quality presentation yesterday, and the concept of runoff is really significant, especially those of us near Lake Champlain and other bodies of water, which is like everybody alive. So that the soil that is treated with an ability to hold more water is going to be subject to less erosion, less runoff. So if there are amendments on your soil, they would tend to run off. So increased soil applications increase the capacity. So here's some statistics. 1% increase in soil matter holds 17 to 25,000 gallons of water more per acre. That's pretty significant. So if we're thinking about if we irrigate, those of us maybe who have sandy soils or have some sort of a slope to contend with, it's a pretty massive level of increase. There's also a growing body of evidence. When I first started talking about carbon sequestration through composting a couple of years ago, John was a little cautious about that, but it's significantly more accepted now that soil treated with compost and compost extracts and more microbial life has a greater capacity to absorb carbon from the atmosphere. And also released to fungi, carbon can store a tremendous amount of long-term, or fungi can store a tremendous amount of long-term carbon. So this is something that we think whenever a government internationally, nationally creates climate change adaptation or mitigation strategies, we believe strongly that composting should be right up in there with those lists of strategies. And that is happening more and more. Biodiversity and ecosystem health is incredibly important. We're going to talk about the concept of a soil food web, not a soil food chain, which is a little bit different way to think about things. And we also, it's important to us. We need the diversity to help build resistance and resilience to things that like pests and diseases that could reduce crop yields, and then we theoretically don't have to use as many harmful chemicals that will harm us directly and also harm our waterways. And community impact comes from all of these. This is a picture from North Country School Camp Treetops in Lake Placid. If anybody gets a chance to visit there, you you definitely should. It is a little piece of heaven. They have a working farm there. The students work the farm. So this is a picture of what that could look like with some really, they have a very aggressive soil health system. They have lots of composting, and this is what Q could end up with. This is a picture, but of cows, and they're doing their thing. But I also want to point out that cows, as we know, are very much a part. Any animal is an extremely important part of any soil food web, because they are pooping, and their poop goes into the soil and contributes to the biome, the microbiome for sure as well. And just the active grazing too does things to the soil underneath the grasses it creates its own local biome of microbiota based on their pressures. Okay, any questions so far? We're going to launch into some inspiring people out there.
Go ahead.
Cool. So I'm going to say leaders in the field. For me, it's John Culpepper right now, but there are two that we tend to follow. One being Dr. Elaine Ingham. If anybody has heard of the Soil Food Web School, John is a current participant in this program, and it is intense, which it should be because there's a lot going on, and it brings to light this idea of something called biologically complete compost. The technical definition is 300 micrograms of bacterial biomass per gram and 300 micrograms of beneficial fungi per gram. So what that means, and we're going to get into some slides in a couple of minutes, is that for a biologically complete compost, you're looking at a certain ratio of bacteria, a certain quantity of protozoa, the presence of nematodes. Those are more indicators, and but basically the ratio of the bacterial biomass and the fungal biomass in that compost. I've heard that you can buy a cubic foot of biologically complete compost for a lot of money. Not that we're all in this for money, but that in certain cultures that recognize the value of biologically complete compost, a very tiny little bit goes a very long way. And Elaine in this picture is probably making compost tea, and we're going to talk about how you can radically reduce the volume of compost that you need to put into your soil by extracting those microbes and basically farming them. And again, Dr. Ingham is very focused on the microplant interactions, and it's magic. It's really magic how the roots of the plants communicate with everything around them, and the roots of the plants will actually create an environment that they need to encourage the microbiology that they need. So they'll create the environment around themselves to attract what it is that they need at that point in time, which is pretty amazing. So this is an example of a soil food web. All of these elements that we see on here are things, except for the birds and the animals, that we actually see in our slides when we take a peek at them. So we have nematodes. A lot of us think of nematodes as damaging, and they can be, but there are also beneficial nematodes, and they have a whole bunch of different roles in the soil food web. They can be eating on roots. So we don't want the bad ones eating I get them in my turnips sometimes, and that's kind of upsetting. But they also will feed on the fungi and the bacteria that are in the soil, and they have a predatory role. And the nematodes then also need to be feeding on other things. So there's the fungi and the protozoa. Arthropods, the first soil sample test analysis I had done under a microscope, I had an arthropod in there, and you're going to see shortly, it was kind of alarming. I was like, what is this thing in my soil? But it's a beneficial critter who also serves a purpose down there in the soil. These are the roles of the different microbiology. So the bacteria break down organic matter and minerals. So that's just bacteria doing what they do. Fungi do the same. They both produce glues that bind the soil particles together. So this is again back where we're thinking about the ability of compost treated soil to help hold water together. And you actually can see this. So any of us who are compost operators, if you do that squeeze test where you can, a really good batch of compost, my fingers will actually be sticky when I squeeze that soil, and you see your healthy compost clumping together. So that's those aggregates. That's what we're wanting to see. That's a really important part of the structural process. Protozoa and nematodes eat each other. It's kind of a brutal world down there, and they eat the bacteria and fungal. And so when this happens, all of these processes are releasing nutrients in what we call a plant available form. So I talked a little bit before about plant succession and what this might look like. So again, not knowing who's in the room, who's familiar with what, but compost, when it's completed, it can be bacterial dominant, it can be fungally dominant, or it could be somewhere with kind of a mix of those two in the middle. Sometimes if you really, some permaculture farmers that I follow will intentionally make batches of compost that are bacterial dominant or fungally dominant to target certain crops. I believe that broccoli, perhaps, I think it is, that prefer a more bacterially dominant soil. But the spectrum of the relationship between that bacterial dominant and fungal dominant soil is on the same concept of plant succession. And this picture here, it shows a line, but as we all know, nothing in nature works in a straight line. So succession happens in cycles. So we get through to a mature forest, and that forest is then, maybe there's a forest fire, maybe they get blown down, and then we go back into an early succession mode. So the point is that the soil health will support whatever it is that where you're at in succession. So looking at bacterial dominated soil, which again is most of the farmers that we tested up here are bacterially dominant, that's where annual weeds and perennial weeds and grasses thrive. So if we're thinking about a format that we can start to reduce weed pressure without overtilling, without herbicides, we can look at the soil health first as our first way to look at avoiding those weed pressures without damaging our soil first through high tillage and again through pesticides. The other person that we don't spend a lot of time with Dr. David Johnson, but I know a lot of people are probably more familiar with him and his work than I personally am. But we just wanted to present that Dr. David Johnson's work. We might have heard of the Johnson-Su approach for composting. So this is another, it's a longer term concept of farming microbes. If anybody here has practiced that or is familiar with that, I'd also love to hear from you and hear more about your experiences. So now we're kind of getting into a little bit of a wrap up, but in a little bit of a recap. But I can't say enough. I don't think I've ever been so in love with microbiology in my life. They're amazing. Like, these little critters are amazing. And those of us who compost, when you go out to your compost pile and there's steam coming off, and something that was a festering pile of rotten pizza scraps, like 2 weeks later is not. It's just this beautiful dark product. It's all the microbiology. So they really are the stars of the show. So I'm going to run through a few slides. These are this is what we see. So when we pull up a soil sample and we look under the microscope, this is what it shows. And I will this sample here would be somebody who is mostly is bacterial dominant compost or soil sample. So it's not bad, but if it's a compost sample, it's likely that this compost either got too hot. That's what happened in my situation, which favored a certain kind of bacterial development. Maybe it's too dry, so there's not a room for fungal and fungal development. So we can also see there's a few more geometric shapes that are probably minerals. So maybe some sand got into the sample. That's not necessarily great if it's a compost sample, but this is bacteria. So this is what it would look like under the microscope. This is a mix of bacteria, and we can start to see some fungal clumping in that one. So this is an example of what it, once we start to get some fungal aggregations and some sporing happening, this is good. This is what you would like to see, and this tends to happen again if you've dialed in your composting processes. If this is a composting sample, a compost sample, you're going to see this. But also, compost will tend to develop. Fungal development happens toward the later stages of the composting process. So for those of us who aren't familiar with this, there's primary decomposition, which is when you want your temperatures to get pretty hot, over 131, theoretically below 160. That can take a couple of weeks depending on your conditions. And then after primary decomposition, you go through a secondary decomposition phase where the cooking slows down. And as it slows down, that's when these fungal bodies hopefully start to develop and things really start to cook and crank. This is there's a perfect example of a protozoa in the upper right-hand corner.
One more question, just before you
Yes,
go too far.
go
There
for
was a
it.
question about whether you're using water, a slide, and a compound microscope to visualize the bacteria and fungi.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. So we, it is a compound microscope. We are using the slide, and I don't know I think it's one tiny drop. He mixes it first into a tube, and I'm not recalling the ratio, but that's certainly if somebody wants to know what that is, I can find it out very easily. So it's a ratio of parts per compost per parts per water. He then gently agitates it 10 times. And at that point, we can already start to see whether or not there's humic acid. The color of the water will indicate the quality of the compost or the soil sample at that point, because if it's clear, there aren't a lot of those like higher level acids that have developed. So from there, he takes a drop out of the tube, puts it on a slide, and slides the microscope cover over that. And then we don't put the oil drop on top. There's nothing like that. He just, and if I wish I could give you the magnification levels. He does the highest magnification level to start with. That's just like general quick scan. He also can go up and down through the layers as he's doing that. And then he goes to the next higher level of magnification, where he's able to really hone in.
Thanks.
And there's the fun critter. Those are the
Alien invader.
Yeah. Yep. But who knew? I didn't know, until you actually look at it. So the soil aggregation, that's what we just saw a few slides that showed those aggregates starting to form, and that tends to happen further down the composting process. So again, those are the glues that you want to see in there. That helps bring bind in organic matter, mineral particles, and those are called micro aggregates. So that's what John's looking for when he does his soil analysis. And then at some point, under the right conditions, these aggregates will combine to form macro aggregates. And in that process, they basically are creating their own environment to help themselves perpetuate and survive. There's lots of pore spaces for air, and that's where the water holding capacity can start to happen. So here's some slides where he's showing those. So you can see some of the fungal hyphae developing there, and as they're forming micro aggregates, and then they start to clump, those micro aggregates start to clump into macro aggregates. And again, we can see the protozoa, the little dots in the background are the bacteria. And there's also, John is very good at telling the difference between nematodes and lint, an organic material. I'm still getting up to that part. So. And here's some more examples of what those aggregations look like. Okay, so nutrient cycling, that's why this is so important in terms of soil health and in terms of plant health, is that we really, the whole point of why we're focused on this is, it's great for us to talk about soil health, but it's also really the reason for that we're talking about it is because it's what's going on above that soil. It's what's going on with our plants that we will want to eat, or that we're using those plants to maintain our fertility or any other purpose. That's the whole reason that we're really focused on this. So bacteria and fungi consume organic matter. We've been talking about this. Some of the minerals, they eat each other. And what that does is it concentrates nitrogen through those processes and other plant foods so it's in their bodies. So when you, now we can start to make some connections. So if we send our soil sample test a way to be tested and we find out, okay, this is what our nitrogen content is, the fact that you have a certain nitrogen content indicates a certain level of compost maturity. Now we start to see why that is, because it's part of what's going on with the microbiology. So the excess nitrogen can be released. Once it's consumed, that excess nitrogen is released into the surrounding soil in a plant available form. And then plants can take those up into their roots. And we talked about this before, but most soils contain all of these nutrients already, but it's the access, it's the plant availability, and putting those nutrients into a nutrient cycle is the job of the microbiology. So it is pretty mind-blowing. Again, this one farmer who's been organically growing religiously for 20 years, she's done all of the right things, and she found out she is a bacterially dominant soil. So, and she's going through a lot of steps to inoculate her soil. This is a person, the structure of her soil is pretty solid, so she needs to inoculate with some microbiology. So, of course, compost for good, compost. That, in our opinion, is that's how you do it. There are other ways. If you can take a pretty good volume of compost, if you're a farmer and you're farming hundreds of acres of land, it's going to be difficult for you to apply an appropriate quantity of compost. So the concept of inoculation is something that we'll talk about in a few minutes. So, but we of course believe firmly in the power of compost as a way to build up that microbiology. For us, we focus on composting, which is the aerobic decomposition. So there's anaerobic processes that we're probably all familiar with. Biodigestion is one example, but we tend to believe that the power of the development of aerobic microbes is what's really needed. High quality compost is quite simply a wide variety of microbes. And again, the importance of looking at that under a microscope can't be understated. Some of this we all might be familiar with, but what John Culpepper also is constantly pushing the envelope on is what can we consider to be organic material, what can be composted. He is, I want to say, pioneering. There's some great work with the Rich Earth Institute and some others, but John is really focused on the composting of human urine and is successfully modeling it at his house. He has created something called the Human Urine Research. There's a D at the end of that. So it's called HERD, and he is basically really focusing on the effects of human urine composting and is having great success with that. So if anybody wants to hear of anything on that line, we'd be happy to connect you. Soiled papers, animal mortalities. We are lots of farmer support for animal mortality composting, slaughterhouse offal, yard debris, food waste, and I think, does Vermont have that? Is it legal to compost bodies for you guys now, or is that coming?
Yep, it sure is.
You had to be. There's no way New York is
recent. It's recent, but yeah.
Okay, ours is quite recent too. So nobody's really doing it yet, but there's one cemetery in the Canton area who's very, very interested. So there's lots of things that can be put into and made into compost. These next few slides are a tiny snippet of the ways that different people can compost. Wooden pallets, I think a lot of us are familiar. That's pretty common process. It allows you to do batches of compost, but in kind of a backyard setting. This is something that they piloted at North Country School Camp Treetops, which is a static bay system, which means it's just one bay that gets the hay is used to bring in the aeration, and it all gets turned over. Aerated static piles is another way that you don't have to be turning your compost. So you're introducing oxygenation through a active and passive aeration process. We just started doing this at our place and are pretty happy with not having to turn things on a regular basis. This is actually a little bit of a tangent, but certainly related, that Compost for Good started because John Culpepper had an idea in his mind that he could build and design a rotating drum composter that was way more affordable than a lot of the models that were on the market. That's actually how I met John. I helped him get a grant to do this. So this is what we came up with. We have an open source design that is available to anybody. We support lots of entities to build them. We have gifted up to 5, I think we're going on our 6th gifted drum composter now. My partner and I built a 5-foot version of this with a steel drum that I'd be happy to talk to people about. But I am, once you operate an in-vessel drum composter, it's kind of hard to go back. It's pretty sweet. The rotating takes care of the mixing. It comes out the end having gone all the way through primary decomposition. Yeah, so if anybody's interested in the drum composter, I am actually doing a presentation for the Institute for Local Self-Reliance next week, specifically on the drum composter, but we'd be happy to share. We also have an operating manual. We'd be happy to talk to you more about that.
And I'll just add that we'll add the link to that the website link there when we post the recording. And
Perfect.
John did give a presentation 2 years ago at the Vermont Organics Recycling Summit on that composter as well. So that's a recorded session that folks can also go back under
Nice.
VORS 2021 to reference.
Perfect. Yeah, he can talk drum composters all day long, which is why I love him. So this is an example of a windrow turner. I'm going to assume most people are familiar with these technologies, but maybe not. This is industrial scale. My partner and I, as in my partner, because he's a mechanic, drove to New Jersey and picked up a smaller version of one of these that he will need to be basically rebuilt. But the concept is that it will straddle a windrow and it mixes the windrow as it goes. You can also design them to infuse water into your pile as you're going, because maintaining a certain moisture content is also a really important part of the process. And this is John's latest baby. So he, and the same concept of the drum composter, has developed a backyard model, and this is how he was composting his human urine before he was gifted a small scale drum composter. And it's quite simple. It is a piece of drum 4-foot culvert that's about 4 feet high, and you layer your debris, your organic material, your browns, which in their case is wood chips, carbon, into the system. And they here's an example of what it actually looks like. So those piles are wood pellets, human urine, and a quantity of food scraps having gone through primary decomposition. And they have a hand crank turner that every so often they go in and they agitate it, but it's performing beautifully. So John is pretty adamant that this is a really affordable neighborhood scale composting option that's out there. When you're done with it, when it's gone through primary decomposition, you just tip it over, and then it goes through secondary in curing piles. And we've sold a number of those systems up here in the North Country recently. So just a little plug on that whole system. So how compost builds healthy soils? Hopefully at this point this is redundant from what we've been saying all along, but the bacteria, protozoa, fungi, nematodes, and microarthropods all inoculate the soil and are the building blocks of the complex of the soil web that we were taking a look at. Without them, none of this beautiful plant development will happen. So one thing that's really important to realize if you decide, okay, I know that I need to do something about my soil, I've looked at it, it's lacking, I want to do something. I want to add compost. I want to add an inoculant to it. I'm not really sure, but I want to do something. One of the most important first steps to do is to make sure that you're addressing the issues that might have caused the soil biology to be hurt in the first place. Again, because the last thing you want to do is come in and do all this work and spend all this money and then realize that you're not addressing the root cause. So one of the more common challenges is compaction. So that could be from your tractor. It could be from over tillage. There's lots of causes for compaction, but that is a really important issue to address. We have just purchased penetrometers also to be distributing to our farmers that will help you identify how compacted your soil is. Chemicals, there are a lot of farmers up here who inherit conventional farms that have a history of a lot of use of chemicals. So that's a pretty typical one. Extreme slopes, so where your soil just doesn't have the capacity. So maybe you have to integrate some terracing or swales to mitigate the effects of those extreme slopes and over tillage. We just can't say enough of that. Another thing I'd add in there too is leaving soil bare. That's another issue that will radically impact your soil biology, and that's a typo, soil biology. That you always want to make sure that there's something covering your soil. So that's another possible damaging factor. You can apply compost by a manure spreader, by hand, by shovel, but it's really important that you apply your compost evenly. Application rates will vary depending on what you're starting with. But this idea of a liquid application is really appealing. Again, if you're spreading compost and you have even a 3-acre farm, that's a lot of compost. So you can, if your soil structure is, if you're happy with it, you can find, maybe there's a local composter that is doing a really great job. Sometimes you can actually buy an inoculant, but there are definitely inoculants out there that it's really important to do your research on. The best option for you is to make your own high quality compost is actually the best option, because then your microbiology matches your local area. But you can extract the microbiology through a compost extract, which is just basically a super simple, like you're just taking your compost, you're putting it into water, and the biology is kind of oozing out into your water. Equally, or probably more impactful, a little bit more involved, but is to make compost tea. And if anybody here has done that, I'd love to hear from you too. This is a little more involved, but that's where you take your compost and you go through a number of steps. It can take about 24 hours if you do it a certain way, and you put it into water, but the water usually has something in it to feed it. There's a ton of recipes out there. My business is just starting to play with this. We will be using kelp, and we bought humic acid to stimulate the process. So we're going to see what happens with that. But molasses is something that I see as part of a compost tea protocol as well. And I will say that right now there are organic farmers who that has to be, or whatever they put onto their farm has to be organic. So there is a huge demand just in the North Country for anybody who's making organic compost to provide an inoculant for these organically certified farms. But even non-organically certified farms, the demand for compost tea as an inoculant is pretty massive right now. So lots of opportunity there. This is it's just a slide. This is the composter that my partner and I built, and that's myself and John Culpepper high-fiving because he helped us build it. But the point of this is that through Compost for Good's work, it really always comes down to one person. It comes down to one person saying, we're not going to do it that way anymore. It comes down to one person saying, all right, I'm going to take this on because I believe in it. And in a compost setting, it's really important to have one person who is that champion and who kind of oversees the entire process. Okay, so how do we keep the biology in our soil for the long term? We want to make sure that you have continuous living roots in your soil. So cover crop, interplanting with perennials, and the root supply sugars for the microbes. So that's a really important thing, that you want there to be something there to encourage the microbes to keep doing their thing. Reducing soil disturbance, we just talked about. Valuing diversity. That's also, it's the plants above the ground, but it's also that directly correlates to the plants or the microbiome below the soil level too. And just to say this again, keep your soil covered. You never want to have soil exposed. Mulch it, cover crop it, crop residue. And also just a reminder that microscopes are very, very valuable. And it's quite a simple process to get to the point of having the ability to analyze your soil or your compost in your own backyard. This is about climate change. We talked about this, composting and climate change mitigation. So, primary takeaways, just as a recap: nature-based solutions, so indigenous knowledge, that's always always so much to learn when we tried our best to mimic nature, but also to provide nature the ability to do what it does best, because it knows way more than we do. Compost is the fastest and the best way to add biology, but you want to make sure not all compost is created equally. So if you are going to apply compost, you might want to take the extra step to have it analyzed under a microscope. If you don't have the ability to do that regionally, we can certainly assist you to find ways to do that. Considering composting as a resource management rather than waste management, y'all probably are on board with that. Maintaining continuous living roots, minimizing soil disturbances, microbes, you want to make them happy, so feeding them with organic matter whenever and however you can. And that is all I have.
Great, thank you. So we have a couple questions and comments, and then it seems like we'll likely have time if we want to pull up those videos. But Deb says a key factor in promoting complex soil food webs is to keep vegetation in the soil around the year. The roots are feeding the microbes naturally, and so you touched on that. And then she asked, is education one of the main missions of your organization?
Sadly, because we're the only ones really doing this work in the Northern New York right now, it's all our mission. But yes, it absolutely is our mission. Between the three of us, among the three of us, Katie tends to be the education outreach person, and we have 2 or 3 grants that are in the queue that would develop a very intentional campaign, an educational campaign. At this point in time, we do it in more of a reactive way. Like we're supporting a university scale food audit research project. So we're helping with that, but it is our mission. Absolutely. Yes, that's the short answer.
Great, thank you. And then Manny asks, would kelp be available in the Midwest or non-coastal areas?
It's available yeah. Go ahead, Natasha.
I was going to say, I think that's referring back to the compost tea, the fed.
Yeah. Sadly, in the environment that we live in, everything's available anywhere. But it might be something, if it were myself, I would want to do some research to see what could be locally available to, they sell it on Amazon. They sell organic kelp on Amazon. So anybody can get it anywhere. But that would be an interesting thing to look into, to see if you want it to be super regional, what do I have in my backyard that could replace kelp? Would be that'd be a worthwhile thing to look into.
And I'm curious if you or anyone else on the call is familiar with SPICE. So it's a static pile inoculated compost extension. We supported through the CAV Soil Builders program back in, I think this was 2021, end of 2021, a fermenting on the farm workshop that was in person, and we have photos, and I can share certainly some information out, but it's this, it's really like, creating this high fermented with all of these different stages, and you start with rice and you let that soak and it gets fermenting, and then you add in molasses, and we added cabbage and we added all this stuff to it. And it's a fascinating project and process that I keep. It's on my somewhat short list of things I want to learn more about. But one of the things that they did talk a lot about was exactly what you just touched on, Jen, which is, a lot of these methods are great, but always be thinking about how you can adapt it to your local biome, what is growing around your area. What are you raising on your farm maybe that could end up as one of the ingredients to feed something like a spice compost mixture that you spray on, or even a compost tea. So what is local and what makes sense? So that means that we need to understand a little bit more about the roles that different ingredients play in a recipe, so we can identify some local substitutions. Absolutely. And I personally have not heard of it. Again, this tends to be more John's domain, but it sounds delicious. And I would love to see if you want, I'd love to see anything you want to share. Yeah. And I can post a link to that when I post the recording, as well as just sort of like resources that we spoke about. Perfect. During this. Yeah. Is that showing up? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay, cool.
Yep. So you can actually see it feeding, which is, this is actually a good, if we're going to put one slide up, this is actually probably really good because we can see everything in this one. So you see the nematode and you can see the bacteria doing their little slow dance in the background too. So, and then some of the protozoa. So, yep, there it is, going in for some snacks.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Nice. And Rhonda says, whoa, very cool. It is cool if you haven't seen it before.
Yeah.
Very fun. Well, thanks so much, Jen. This was really fun. I love talking soil biology with people. So thanks again, Jen. Fabulous. Looking forward to staying in touch and sharing some of these great resources that we have. Thanks, everybody.